Oh, nothing better. Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSPS. Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm going to spend most of this piece talking about the lovely, happy topic of assassination. But before that, I just came across this on the socials, and this kind of goes to how difficult trying to work out what's going on, how difficult it is trying to work out the front line and mapping. So here we have Speaker of the Ukrainian Forces, Hanna Malia, confirms the full liberation of Andriivka. Situation in Klishchiivka is most certainly the same. Russian sources tell that they had been pushed out from the village yesterday. Okay, so brilliant. Right, the Ukrainian General Staff effectively said Andriivka is now liberated, Klishchiivka is most certainly liberated. And then you hear update. Hanna Malia edited her initial post. Apparently her claim was indeed too premature because she changed the part where she claimed Andriivka is liberated. Quote, Andriivka, the situation is very complex and changeable. We keep our fists together. And then Max23 says, what the heck is going on? The commander of the 3rd Brigade denies the capture of Andriivka. Quote, such statements from Hanna Malia are harmful, pose a threat to the lives of personnel and harm the performance of combat missions. So that's really not a good sign that you've got that kind of anger from within the Ukrainian forces. And it's just, it's just interesting to see these kind of situations where, I the other day, I think Opitny was possibly an example of this, where you have differing people from within the Ukrainian military sort of network saying different things. Official sources of the 3rd Assault Brigade of Ukraine, the one which is fighting in Andriivka direction, says that Hanna Malia's report about liberation is premature and false. Difficult one that. She's got to get her information from somewhere, so she's not making stuff up. So that would have come from somewhere, but I don't know whether communication lines are somehow confused, or the real message is distorted. I don't know how that happens, because either somewhere is liberated or it ain't. But anyway, just thought I'd throw that one in there. Right, we're going to talk about assassination mainly today. Assassination and bears in zoos. So The Economist came out with this article, and I meant to share this with you like over a week ago, but things are crazy. Inside Ukraine's assassination program. Now, I was going through this article to work out what I needed to highlight to tell you, and it turns out I pretty much highlighted the whole article. So let's have a little read of this together. I'm like your audiobook. It's John's Book Club. And then we're going to go into the Ukraine Latest podcast from last week after this article came out to see what Dom Nichols has to say about it. So the article starts. The operation was a month in the making. Yevhen Yunikov, the mayor of Veliki Burluk in the Kharkiv region, had been identified as a collaborator with the Russians' Caucasus. A special forces commander and a group of loyal officers were given the job. His men watched their target meticulously for days when he shopped when and where he moved, the extent of his security. Once they detonated their bomb from a distance, they disappeared to safe houses inside occupied territory. The group would return to Ukrainian-controlled territory only weeks later after the town had been liberated. Yunikov's body has never been found. Over 18 months of war, dozens of people like Yunikov have been targeted in clinical operations across occupied Ukraine and inside Russia itself. They have been shot, blown up, hanged, and even on one occasion poisoned with doctored brandy. Ukraine is tight-lipped about its involvement in assassinations, but few doubt the increasingly competent signature of its security services. The agencies themselves drop heavy hints. Quote, any person who betrays Ukraine, shoots at Ukrainians or fires missiles at Ukrainians should understand that they are being watched and will be brought to justice, says Andriy Cherniak, an officer of HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence agency. In an interview in July, his boss, General Kirilo Budanov, went further. Quote, if you're asking about creating a version of Mossad, we don't need to. It already exists. Now, before I go on, there's going to be this discussion. We'll be having this discussion somewhat, and Dom Nichols talks about it, about the morality of assassination. But essentially, assassination, like in its most simplest of forms, assuming you've got bona fide kind of military targets or targets that have a military effect, if you like. Assuming you've got good bona fide targets, then assassination is actually the most efficient way of doing warfare. So some people kind of balk at the idea of assassination, but if you go to war, then you're like, okay, here's 20,000 soldiers fighting against 20,000 soldiers. Turns out like 13,000 people have died now. Loads of people injured and maimed. All these families without these people, as these kind of pawns are sent into battle with each other. And the decision makers back here are kind of moving them around. Well, if you can assassinate some of those decision makers, then those pawns might not have to be sacrificed. If you are just, these people are, it's okay apparently for these people to kill each other using horrific weapons. All sorts of different thermobaric munitions, even nuclear warhead, right, is within the realms of acceptability to, as in they've not been outlawed, and we can have that argument again, and chemical weapons and whatnot. But, we can use all this stuff to do war, but somehow assassination is that's a bit dodge. Well, actually, it's the most efficient way of achieving arguably the same results, right? And there is a distinct lack of collateral damage. You don't get missiles flying into civilian apartment blocks and whatnot. So we can have some moral arguments, but I do think assassination is well within the moral remits of warfare if you're going to allow warfare, right? Anyway, to go back to the article and talk of Mossad, mention of the Israeli spy agency animates Ukrainians desperate for justice. In fact, the origins of political assassination are a little closer to home. Mossad learned much of its craft from the Soviet-era secret police and its founding practitioner Pavel Sudoplatov, who was born in Melitopol in now-occupied southern Ukraine. In a quirk of history, Sudoplatov spent the 1930s infiltrating Ukrainian nationalist groups and personally blew up one of their leaders with a chocolate box bomb. He also masterminded the assassination of Leon Trotsky in 1940. In modern Ukraine, assassinations date back to at least 2015, when its domestic security service, SBU, so you've got the HUR, which is Budanov and the intelligence services, and then you got the domestic security service, SBU, created a new body after Russia had seized Crimea and the eastern Donbass region. The elite 5th Counterintelligence Directorate started life as a saboteur force in response to the invasion. It later came to focus on what is euphemistically called wet work. Valentin Nalivachenko, who headed the SBU at the time, says the switch came about when Ukraine's then leaders decided that a policy of imprisoning collaborators was not enough. Prisons were overflowing, but few were deterred. Quote, "We reluctantly came to the conclusion that we needed to eliminate people," he says. A former officer of the directorate describes it in similar terms. Quote, "We needed to bring war to them." In 2015 and 2016, the directorate was linked to the assassinations of key Russian-backed commanders in the Donbass, Mikhail Tolstych, aka Givy, killed in a rocket attack; Arsen Pavlov, aka Motorola, blown up in a lift; Alexander Zakharchenko, blown up in a restaurant. Intelligence insiders say the SBU's 5th Directorate is playing a central role in counter-Russia operations. The SBU's relative size and budget 5 times bigger than the HUR's, so the Domestic Security Service has a budget that is 5 times as big as the intelligence, as Budanov's intelligence directorate. I mean, it has been most able to pull off the most sophisticated jobs. For example, bombing the Kerch Bridge, linking Russia to Crimea in October 2022. Others, though, emphasize the role of HUR with its underground networks and increased wartime prominence. Quote, "We are mostly the white-collar guys," insists an SBU source. Another increasingly important player in occupied Ukraine is the Special Operations Forces, SSO. This is a relatively new group that coordinates Rukh Opori resistance movement, Ukraine's partisans. The operation in Kharkiv, for example, was the SSO's. Denis Yaroslavsky, an officer in the SSO, says that the service is now pushing for more powers to conduct operations within Russia itself. That is not universally welcomed elsewhere in Ukraine's intelligence community. So they're going to go on to talk about one a little bit later. You remember the the naval commander, I think it was, responsible for the release of cruise missiles, who was murdered jogging in Crimea. Anyway, Ukraine's president is understood to authorize the most controversial operations, though other decisions are delegated. A high-level government source with knowledge of work declines to discuss the details. Quote, "It's important not to comment or even think about such operations." But he says that Zelensky has issued a clear order to avoid collateral damage among civilians. So that's one of the benefits of these kind of activities, that arguably, if you do it well, you are eliminating one person and no one else, right? And that one person is super crucial. We'll get onto that issue a little bit later, because the argument is that actually some of the people being assassinated aren't super crucial. Anyway, to continue, quote, "The president communicates this instruction, which is not to kill civilians, to people formally and on occasion by shouting at them." Ukraine, that's an interesting little aside, by the way. If he's shouting at people, like if that's true, and I assume it is, if he's getting really angry about the civilian collateral damage that may have been caused in one particular operation or whatever, well, there are two things at play there. I mean, A, it shows that he deeply cares, because he's angry and he's shouting about the loss of civilian life. Now, the question is, does he care from a moral position or from a PR position, or indeed both? And it's probably both. I think the person is a good human being. Like Zelensky is a decent person. He was an actor, just a kind of, but with a law degree. So, you know, just a decent, normal human in having normal life. He's going to have kind of normal, ordinary morality, right? And so he's going to be indignant about the unnecessary loss of human civilian life. Of course he will be. But there's also the PR aspect at play, that if Ukraine do things that third-party onlookers look at and go, "Oh, that's not great," or "that doesn't look good," or "there's death of innocents there," then it doesn't look good for Ukraine. This war is a war fought in the spotlight. And you could almost say it's unfair on Ukraine. Ukraine are having to abide by expectations that I think no other nation has ever had to abide by when conducting warfare, because no other nation has had their wars inspected through magnifying glasses, with social media plastering everything that happens across the internet. Now, on the other hand, that means that they are held to higher expectations and end up doing things, you know, more morally carefully. So there are pros and cons to that. I mean, but it might mean that they can't do something that you might think is morally dubious, but might have had a much bigger effect on the course of the war. But, you know, you might have done that like 30 years ago, 50 years ago, but now with everyone watching, it's very hard to get away with doing something like that. Anyway, to continue, Ukraine had to choose its targets carefully, the source adds. It might not always have done so. So that's kind of talking to that. Ukraine's leadership came under particular scrutiny in October when the New York Times reported that American government was blaming it for a car bomb that killed Daria Dugina, daughter of Alexander Dugin, a nationalistic philosopher. I mean, here's a guy that's been producing a whole lot of thought and words, books that Putin has been using to kind of drive his own nationalistic philosophy in terms of executing this war and, you know, national domestic policy and whatnot. So anyway, I don't know if you remember, but the Ukrainians were targeting Dugin, but I think they swapped cars. Him and his daughter swapped cars, and she ended up dying. That sharpened an already lively internal debate within Ukrainian intelligence. It was unclear if Ms. Dugina was meant to die, Ms. Dugina. Some reports suggest she had switched cars with her father. But a subsequent string of operations targeting mid-level propagandists showed a trend that few of the insiders interviewed for this article were happy with. Quote, "These are marginal figures," says one source in SBU counterintelligence. "It makes me uncomfortable." So take the mill blogger in St. Petersburg, who was aligned, I think, to Wagner. He was in a restaurant receiving a gift, a statuette or a statue that had a bomb inside it, and then it blew him up and killed him. I don't even remember me reporting that. But anyway, the argument might be that those kind of people just don't justify assassinations. The former SBU 5th Directorate officer suggests the operations were designed to impress the president rather than bring victory any closer. Quote, clowns, prostitutes and jokers are a constant around the Russian government. He says, kill one of them and another will appear in their place. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I'd have to know more about the actual ramifications of killing someone like that. How much effect did that have? I mean, there are plenty of other mill bloggers, but I mean, I'd say they're a useful target. They're spreading propaganda, and in that way, they're pretty evil. They're doing the work of the government, and they are even doing things to recruit. We've seen there are a number of sources, like the BBC video I showed you some of the other day talked about the Russian mill bloggers and how some of them actively recruit or implicitly recruit. One of the collaterals of them producing that stuff is that you get people on the front line saying, yeah, I joined because of what this guy said on the internet. So I don't know the value of taking out these mid-level people. Obviously, some of these that are being interviewed here are saying that they're not high enough value. But I suppose it's an open question. The former spy says he's concerned with Ukraine's assassination campaign being driven by impulse rather than logic. Some of the killings have a useful psychological role, he says, to raise the cost of war crimes and the spirits of ordinary Ukrainians. This was certainly the case with Stanislav Ruzitsky, a former submarine commander, this guy I mentioned earlier, believed to have fired the missiles that killed 38 Ukrainians in Vinnytsia in July 2022. He was shot dead a year later while jogging in a park in Krasnodar in Russia. Actually, that was in Russia, not in Crimea, so sorry, my bad. But other operations suggested an absence of strategy. They risked exposing sources, methods, and the extent of Ukrainian infiltration into Russia. Our security services shouldn't do things just because they can. Andriy Yusov, a military intelligence spokesman, insists Ukraine is avoiding what he called blind terror. The aim is, quote, not to frighten the enemy, he says, but to force it from occupied Ukrainian lands. But Ukrainian spies would continue to, quote, identify and take advantage of Russian psychology and vulnerabilities wherever they found them. Of course, the converse is also true. The infiltration of Ukraine's security services by Russian agents remains a big issue. In the estimation of some insiders, it is the largest single barrier to any attempts to create a Ukrainian Mossad. The former head of SBU's internal security has fled Ukraine under a cloud of suspicion and is being investigated for treason in absentia. Trust remains an issue in the service. Goodness me, an intelligence service like that is going to have trust issues. I mean, your spies, it's just the whole nature of it is kind of duplicity, isn't it? With all but the least sensitive operations conducted in small groups, quote, people are always our weakest link, says the SBU counterintelligence source. Quote, they are by far the most slippery part of our calculations. Right, and this was discussed by Ukraine Latest and Don Nichols, who is a former military man himself. He actually wrote a dissertation on assassination, as you'll find out. But this is about 6 or 7 minutes of an excerpt. I hope that's not too long, but I think it's a really good discussion. I normally listen to this guy on 2 times speed, right? So it just seems very strange to hear him speak so slowly.
Dom has some thoughts on this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Francis, for giving us the overview there. Well, Dom, you were telling us earlier, you wrote your master's dissertation on targeted assassinations. What's your take on this story from The Economist?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story, worth a look, and an area to be explored, because this gets right to the heart of what we've been talking about for the last year and a half, really. Military service, killing, murder, all the rest of it, and where you draw the line. And assassination has never really been in the purview of the military as such, because it's not always been that possible. Let me explain that. I mean, we start from the standpoint that killing is wrong. That's the liberal democratic idea. Killing is wrong, except in self-defense, obviously. But of course, the state does carve out for itself areas where killing is not wrong. So law enforcement, military action. Some countries still have capital punishment. You can debate the rights and wrongs of all these things, but there are some areas where the state says, actually, it is lawful for me to kill you. Now, in the military arena, that goes a stage further. The military are allowed to take life, including collateral damage. So those that innocent civilians is a phrase sometimes used. I don't particularly like the phrase, but collateral damage is a bit wonky. But what we mean by that is people you don't intend to kill. And that's obviously subject to certain constraints, that the action must be legal, proportionate, necessary, must be properly planned and authorised, and so on and so forth. But
there's lots of conversation about this in terms of missiles, right? So missiles being assumed that Russia's sent a missile into Ukraine. Now, the question is, are they targeting civilians directly? If they are, then that is not collateral damage, that is a war crime. But let's assume that they are genuinely targeting a military facility. But if they're using a missile with a circle error probable of 300 meters, that means 50% of the time that missile is shot, it needs to fall within 300 meters of that target. But 50% of the time, it can fall outside of that 300 meters. And even if it falls within the 300 meters, that's still not hitting the target necessarily. Like, it depends, how big the target is. And so there's a lot of scope for, okay, you want to use missiles that are more accurate than 300 meters circle error probable, but that's still, a precision guided munition that's just not super accurate. Now, there's a lot of scope for killing innocent civilians or having collateral damage there, but in so doing, like, if you're genuinely targeting the military target, then that is an acceptable part of war. Of course, the question is, well, could they have used a more accurate weapon? Like, was that weapon proportionate to the target? So say they were trying to blow up, I don't know, a little communications box, right? That's literally half the size of this desk. And it's just what they use to do some radio communications from here to there. And they're using an anti-ship missile that's pretty inaccurate. Or even if they're using a really accurate one, but say it's like a really big bomb, and then that has collateral damage, and that's not proportionate, right? So you're using the wrong thing. Or if they use a missile which they know is really, really inaccurate, they could use a much more accurate missile, but they use an anti-ship missile in a land situation where it can get all confused and goes and hits a apartment block and kills lots of people, then arguably that's a war crime, even though they might have been aiming for the military target, but they kind of used the wrong weapon to do so. So there's lots of arguments to have about this, but the idea is that you can have collateral damage within the confines of warfare, but there are lots of constraints attached to that.
The military is legally allowed to take life, including collateral damage, not just of people trying to kill them, but by dint of the position those folk are in, i.e. if they're in the military, they therefore pose a threat to the lives of our service personnel in the future because of the roles they are likely to undertake. And the argument is, therefore, I can target you now for an action that you will probably take in the future. That's why you are now targetable, and I reserve myself the legal right to kill you. Now, you can take that a stage beyond this. Now, Al-Qaeda did this. Many terrorist groups do. Russia, you can argue, has done. And that is by taking the argument into saying, well, you, Western society, this democratic society, you have elected the people who are making the decision to invade country X, Y, to go to war, and so on and so forth. Therefore, I hold you accountable for that, and I think you are targetable. So this is what, as I say, Al-Qaeda most explicitly, Russia to a certain degree, but it's all similar moral territory, saying, I can kill anybody I like because you are just as much to blame. Al-Qaeda are very open about it, clearly, as many others are, ISIS and so on and so forth. But Russia explains away all these bombs on pizza restaurants by saying, well, there were some military people in there talking. They were discussing military plans. So it was a military, albeit for that brief time, it was a military headquarters. Therefore, it's entirely targetable. I can do what I like. I mean, it's utter hogwash, and it doesn't stand up anywhere. But that's the kind of territory you're in. So there's very definitely three kind of areas: self-defense, then legally being able to take life, and then that third area of saying I'm blaming everybody for this position, so I reserve for myself the right to kill you. So there are different ways, different areas we should think about this. I'm not telling you what to think, but this is how I would suggest we should think about it, the framework with which to have these debates. And then you talk about the capability. So it's very difficult to target individual people. It has been up till now. We've seen these videos of drones being dropped on individual trench positions and soldiers and tanks and what have you. So it is now becoming more possible and personal. But you arguably don't get any more personal than...
Which you could argue is sometimes an assassination of an individual person on the battlefield. I mean, that's what snipers are kind of doing. They're just, possibly identifying particular people. Like, I'm a sniper and I want to take out the commander, and I'm going to do that. Rather, I'm not going to shoot all these other people. I'm just waiting for the person I really need, more important, higher value target, and because I know I've only got one shot before it all goes crazy. And I'm going to take him out. And that is, in a sense, an assassination, right? You could argue.
A targeted assassination, whereby you pick your target, you research that target, where they're going to be, you choose your moment of that you're going to take action, and arguably the more effort that you put into it, then the least ground you will be given in terms of if anybody else is caught up in that. If there was any collateral damage, and in a court of law later on you're shown to have watched that target for months and known his or her movements to the exact minute that they come out of their house, get in the car and drive to work, then they'll say, well, why did you set the bomb off when they're at the busy junction of 45th Street and Main, or whatever? Just getting into my Americanisms for next week. But so targeted assassination puts a greater responsibility, you could argue, on those that are then going to carry out that action. And it shouldn't necessarily be thought of as a separate moral area, provided the target is a legitimate target. And again, huge legal territory here about what's legitimate, what's proportionate, and so on and so forth.
And when you're talking about assassinating people maybe behind front lines, back in, say, Russia or occupied territories, when you're talking about a mayor of a place, there's maybe some wriggle room around, or some argument to be had around whether that is a legitimate target. A politician, a mayor of somewhere that's collaborating with the armed forces, involved in sort of facilitating military activities, perhaps, where do you draw the line of in a nation full of people as to who is a legitimate target in warfare and who isn't, and therefore who is a legitimate target for assassination and who isn't?
Now, provided it's a legitimate military target, then you don't get any more precise. And we like precision-guided munitions. We like to try and remove the threat to others who aren't necessarily to be targeted. So you don't get any more precise than eyeballing the person you're going after and killing them. I mean, it's grim stuff. It really is. But ultimately, this is what you expect men and women to do. And it is a bit of a moral fudge to say, well, actually, I'd prefer if you just stayed a few hundred kilometres back and bunged a few missiles. I'd feel better about that. No, if you want this to be precise and you don't want children and other people to be killed who are not targetable, then ultimately you do want precise military assassinations. This came into...
I mean, just imagine, the whole idea of if you could have assassinated Hitler in 1938 or something. Well, yeah, there you go. It's a kind of moral consequentialist judgment here. So just to remind you, moral consequentialism is that the consequences of a given action are how you obtain moral value. So it's like, you might say lying is categorically bad, right? Which is not consequentialism. You say, like Immanuel Kant, as a philosopher, said that it's a categorical imperative that you shouldn't lie. And he would even say that even if a child murderer came round to your house and said, "Do you know where Jack and Jill are?" and you know that Jack and Jill are upstairs playing with their toys, and if you said, "Oh, I don't know where they are. I think they went off down the street," so it saves those kids' lives. Immanuel Kant would say, "Well, that's morally wrong. You shouldn't. It's morally wrong to lie. It's just categorically wrong." Whereas I would say, well, no, actually, I think the consequences to my action is what obtains moral value there. So me lying is actually a good thing because of the consequences it obtains, which is saving two little kids' lives, right? and we can argue about morality there, but in terms of like assassinating Hitler before he did it, you can make a really good case that if that had saved World War II, then that would have saved gazillions of lives, right? And that there's moral value in that decision to, or a good moral value in that decision to assassinate Hitler.
The reason I looked into this for my dissertation was that I was rather struck by, you may remember the action that was alleged to have been by Mossad, the Israeli spy agency, when a number of operatives were dressed up as tennis players and they went to Dubai to kill a member of a Palestinian terrorist organisation. And they did it under British and Australian passports. Now, Jack Straw, who was the Labour Foreign Secretary at the time, kicked off and said this is outrageous, using British passports, blah, blah, blah. But he didn't actually criticise the act, didn't criticise the targeting of it, which might have been a diplomatic nicety, but actually he was probably correct, I think, in the moral stance there. He was going on about how it was not fair to do it on British passports. But this was that was a targeted assassination. The research had gone in. Only the person that was identified as the target and had been cleared was attacked and killed. So you could argue that whilst it is a bit grim and it is very personal, that is what you would ultimately want your military forces to be able to do if you so wish. Now, I've skirted over a whole load of issues there. There's a 25,000-word dissertation, if anyone's particularly interested, that you can dig into all this sort of stuff. But it is worth thinking about because it's live and we're having to deal with it every day. And it's very easy to feel conflicted on this about when it is legal and not legal to take life. It's easy for other people to claim that they reserve for themselves the right to take life when there is none. And you'll hear a lot of people shouting from every side. So all we try and do here on the pod is talk about the armour we have, the framework with which to receive this information, and then make your own minds up. So have a think about all the stuff I said there. And as I say, as pretty grim as it is to actually go out and specifically say, I am going to kill you, not you generally, the 76th Guards Division or whatever, but you to an individual. It is grim, but it is the most precise action you can take. It's up to the individual who's going to carry out that act at the last moment to think for him or herself, actually, you know what? They don't look like the photograph. I'm not sure this is him. Right, call it off. You have that possibility. So as weapons get more precise and as we expect men and women to go into harm's way, arguably to do this sort of thing, we need to arm ourselves with the arguments about how to think about it so we can have a better discussion.
And there you go. Let me know what you think. I think it's an interesting area for discussion. Obviously, a bit of moral philosophy to be done, but just also there is a discussion. I think the important discussion about how far into kind of society and politics you can go to find a justifiable military target. I think that's the possibly the discussion to be had about this. I don't have a problem with assassination at all in times of war. It might be different in times of peace, right? To be able to use that tool to gain political advantage over another nation. You probably could make a case that if you're doing that to stop a war happening or some other such argument, I guess there's a case to be made that essentially that is to say murder is okay in certain situations, which is kind of what we do in war. And that's what the whole difficulty of war versus peacetime. But certainly in wartime, I think murder is fine because that's what war is. Like a battle is just mass murder of people on other people. But I think it's justifiable, especially, justifiable if you're the defender, right? How far does that go into civilian life? I don't know. That's maybe a tough one. Right, we're going to go from taking life to giving life now. And here we have the story of a bear that has been rescued and adopted by Scottish Zoo here. So let's hear what has to be said. Okay, so I'll read out the subtitles for those watching. So this bear from eastern Ukraine has survived Russian occupation. He has been adopted by a Scottish zoo.
Bears, just like people, can suffer mental health issues similar to post-traumatic stress syndrome after they've been through something really traumatic. Yampol was in a tiny zoo right on the edge of Ukraine that was heavily involved in the fighting during the war. And when the Ukrainian soldiers returned to the zoo, he was one of the only animals still alive. We believe many of the Russian soldiers may have actually killed and eaten the other animals in the zoo. So he's obviously been through a lot of trauma, and one could only imagine what's happened to his mental state. He seems to be settling down, and he's managed to have enough resilience that he's coping with it. And so hopefully we can help him along that journey and look after him, and he can be a happy and healthy bear again for the next several decades of the rest of his life with us here in Scotland.
So that's a bit more of a positive story for you to end today's video. Anyway, let me know what you think below. Let's have a discussion about that pretty horrible topic of assassination. I'll be interested to see what your thoughts are. As ever, I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much for that, and particularly a big thanks to Donald Herchik, who has supported the channel. Really appreciate that, and to all the members, of course, and kind people out there. Thank you. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.